Welcome to FlyWire's production of Eagle Academics. This one's on spatial disorientation. Okay, today we're going to review two Bonanza accidents that resulted from spatial disorientation. It's a deadly thing and it's insidious, so please stick around for some lessons learned. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on FlyWire we're going to talk about spatial disorientation. Quite often we talk about life and death topics in a matter-of-fact kind of way, but for some reason spatial disorientation is more terrifying to most pilots. I must admit that it is to me. For you it may be no big deal, but for me I think spatial D is so scary because I've got a good imagination, and probably you as well, and you can see yourself easily in the same predicament. It's pretty scary. So this is a really huge topic, and in a short video like this I can't rehash all of the good info that the FAA and others have out there on the web and in print and video even. That's not even my objective. What I want to do is I want to look behind the scenes in this video. I want to build some awareness and offer a strategy to work through the distractions and the spatial disorientation if it should happen to you. Okay, I mean all the words and all that other stuff, I think they kind of they explain it well, but they miss the salient points, I think, of connecting it to things that happen in the real world. I plan on doing this by reviewing the accident file of two Bonanza mishaps to discover the gotchas and then determine a strategy so that we might avoid the same thing happening to us. Both of these Bonanza accidents are loss of control in flight after entering IMC, but they are both very different setups, almost completely different in their setup. As with all accidents, there's a chain of events that led directly to the accident itself and its aftermath. And I'm sure you know this, but if just one of those links in the chain had been broken, the accident would not have happened. And with any luck, this video might serve to break the chain in a potential future accident. Okay, just having that awareness, maybe, raising the hairs on the back of your neck to make you think twice. The first accident we're going to look at hits close to home. When I was growing up, my dad was a member and then the CFI for a flight club in San Antonio, Texas. It was called the Flying Tin. They had an F-33A, an A-36, and a V-35B. Mostly I like flying the V-35B. After all, it's probably the most sexy one of the bunch. And that particular airplane is our first accident to review. The pilot who owned the airplane had owned the Bonanza for many years. He held an ATP certificate and very much so was qualified in the airplane. The accident happened in the middle of the afternoon of a late spring day on the East Coast. There was IMC conditions that existed off and on through the entire planned cross-country flight from South Carolina to Connecticut. Appropriately, the pilot had gotten a weather report, had filed an IFR flight plan, and he was on that IFR flight plan when the accident happened. Okay, and that's a good thing, but then there's some not so good things that happened too. About 20 minutes before the accident, the pilot was on top of the cloud deck in VFR conditions, and he reported to ATC that his vacuum pump had failed. He had a couple of things that he wanted. Okay, he wanted to proceed to his destination. He didn't want to descend into clouds, and he declared an emergency. Okay, the not descend into clouds and declare an emergency, I think, are good ideas. Fairly good approach to the plan. So nearing home, the pilot requested vectors to a GPS approach at his destination. And the weather at that time was 800 foot broken. Soon after that request, and then he was granted, the pilot entered IMC. 4 minutes later, or 4 minutes prior to the accident, the pilot reported to ATC that he had lost a little bit of control. I'm still not quite sure what a little bit of control is. The controller issued a new heading. 3 minutes to go, the pilot acknowledged the heading change, reported that he had lost more instruments, and was turning to a new heading. He was also trying to get back to 7,000 feet. He said all that stuff. But no more communications after this were made between the controller and the pilot. Radar data showed that the airplane made several excursions in course and altitude before the aircraft actually broke up in flight and disappeared from the radar. Not a good outcome. Okay, during the accident investigation, the investigators noted that the vacuum pump had 373 hours on it. Well, the manufacturer had recommended overhaul at 500 hours, so it was well below that time frame. But the important point, it is important to note, frankly, that the manufacturer also recommended an overhaul at 6 years from manufacture date. And the vacuum pump that was in the airplane had been installed in that airplane over 16 years previously. So I think it's safe to say that time was a factor in the failure of that vacuum pump in this accident. The airplane did have an electronic turn coordinator. It did not have a backup vacuum system or an alternate attitude indicator. Totally relying on the turn coordinator as your backup. So a couple of things jump out at me on this accident, okay? For me, probably the most prominent one is currency, okay? Presumably, the owner pilot was the only one to fly the accident airplane, which means that he had, do the math real quick, approximately 23 hours per year flying that airplane. I cannot see how you can maintain currency, IMC, or IFR flying at that, in IMC, IFR flying at that rate. To me, 800 broken is pretty serious IMC conditions. Another issue was that single point of failure in the vacuum pump, okay? Before the invention of the attitude indicator, pilots flew in the clouds all the time with needle, ball, and airspeed. That was the way you did it. And it was common. The old needle and ball, however, they were true indicators of what was happening in the airplane. But a modern turn coordinator, an electric turn coordinator, lags what is happening to the airplane by a significant margin. That means it's behind what's happening to the airplane. And I know from practice that for me, transferring reference to the turn coordinator, that's really easy for you to say, transferring reference to the turn coordinator as my sole reference for attitude is nearly impossible. It was super hard. Add turbulence and the stress of being in the soup, and it's problematic. It's unfortunate, but that turn coordinator design has taken quite a few lives, people depending on it as their sole backup in the weather. Nowadays, virtually every electronic flight bag from ForeFlight to iFly has a GPS-derived six-pack to use in emergencies. The two issues here are maintain currency for the kind of flying that you intend to do, or just don't do it, okay? And two, develop a plan and a backup plan for instrument failures. Have one pre-chosen, so you know you don't have to think about it in the air because the stress is so great, you're not going to think clearly. Have a plan, execute it, okay? Full disclosure, I've got 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 backups with my ForeFlight to my primary attitude reference system. And I can activate any one of those in less than 10 seconds. So what is your plan? I'd like to know. I think it'd be a good thing to put it in the comments down below. Let's discuss that. What are the other options out there? The other thing that stands out in this accident for me is the decision to continue. It's very likely that the airplane had full fuel on takeoff. We don't know that, but I expect probably was the case. So with good fuel management, the pilot could have had another 2 or even 3 hours of fuel for a divert to a VFR field. So the concept here is stay out of the weather if you can. A diversion may be inconvenient, but frankly it's a no-brainer when given the alternative of a funeral. Much better choice. I can take a delay, get a rental car, whatever. I've done that. Finally, I'm not sure if you noticed here, but the pilot had entered IMC and reported trouble maintaining control of the airplane. This is a really important point. The controller responded by issuing a heading change, okay? Sitting in my armchair in my hangar right here, I think that might be the worst thing for the pilot to do at that point in time. Well, the controller meant well. His concern was directing the pilot to that GPS final as quickly as he could to get that fellow on the ground. That was his objective. The pilot meant well. He wanted to comply with the controller's instructions, okay? It might be an airplane out there that he might run into. He doesn't know. I understand all that. But from my perspective, the pilot had already declared an emergency, okay? So it was up to him to choose what he was going to do next. He knew his situation, and it was paramount on him to only do what he could reasonably do, okay? It's my nickel that the thing he had to do first was fly the airplane first. If you've seen in the other video, we talked about that. To regain control of his flight path and level the wings. He was obviously having trouble with that. He needed to fly the airplane first. What direction he was going in, what altitude he was flying, well, frankly, that was immaterial. He had to regain control of his heading and his attitude. The next most important thing here is to make small changes in one axis at a time. Change heading, fly straight for a bit. Change altitude, fly straight for a bit, okay? One thing at a time. Your references here are minimal, and that margin for error is minuscule. Don't forget here that the controller is not in the hot seat. He's going to have a cup of coffee in a minute. You're in the hot seat, and you need to calm down and focus on the most important things one at a time, and stay within your new maneuver boundaries. Realize every time you move your head, you get a different sensation in the weather, and you got to keep a very narrow focus on that. It can be done, but you're going to have to be prepared for it. And after all of that, you get control of the airplane, I think you should consider diverting to VFR instead of trying to shoot approach. Just probably not a good plan. The second accident we're going to look at is an A-36 Bonanza. And this pilot wanted to get his night landing currency up to date. Okay, understandable. Go fly at night, rehack your landing currency, and I don't know, is he going to go on a trip? It's unknown. Why he chose this particular night. Was it for a trip or some other reason? We just don't know. In this place, it was an evening with a waxing moon, okay, which means that it was declining. It was a very small amount of illumination. And in the late fall, and the pilot took off well after sunset, and this was in a rural area of the Deep South. What does all that mean? Well, it means it was a very dark night. Very few sources of light. Lots of trees. And there aren't any storms around, but the NDSB was actually unable to determine whether the pilot had actually gotten a weather briefing, which if he had, or the airport he had reported this, there was a cloud layer between 500 and 1,000 AGL. Frankly, that's not exactly straight up VFR. To complicate that, the pilot his last log night flight was over a year previously, and he had done no night flying in this particular Bonanza, okay? I must admit, I'm a little uncomfortable with this setup here. The hair on the back of my neck is standing up, okay? I'm going, man, I don't like this. From my perspective, I would prefer to have something closer to a full moon, no clouds in sight for a recurrent night ride, especially after a long break like that. A year is a pretty long time. I would really like a discernible horizon too, but that's just me. To make it more complicated here, the pilot had just received his instrument ticket less than 2 months prior to the accident, okay? And he had only flown a total during the whole time anyway of 4.5 hours of IMC. And only 0.3 of that was in the accident airplane. So familiarity with the airplane, its performance, and the avionics had to be an issue here. Okay, so what can I say? The pilot took off into the night under what could only be described as marginal visual conditions without a flight plan, which is unfortunate because if he had followed a flight plan and had conducted the flight under IFR, then he would have been mentally prepared for the IMC when he ran into it, okay? And then the flight on instruments. That's a huge factor here. And that mental preparation and trying to go from VFR night with few references to IFR is a big factor in this accident. I've been in a situation where my eyes and brain were calibrated for bright day VFR, only to be thrust into needing to be on the gauges within seconds as I flew into a cloud. I was on the wing, I flew into a cloud, I lost sight of my lead. Let's just say that my eyes and my hands had trouble doing what my brain was screaming at them to do. It was a tense situation. And what I realized was my eyes had this basketball tendency. I couldn't hardly focus on the attitude indicator. It was a problem. Anyway, 4 minutes in our accident we're looking at here. 4 minutes airborne. He'd been airborne. He radioed ATC, realized he was in a problem, and he requested an approach back to the takeoff airport. The controller identified him on radar, cleared him direct to a fix on the approach, and he directed a climb to 2,000 feet. Well, that's good. He's trying to help him out, okay? A lot of stuff to do in a very rough situation here. The pilot acknowledged the clearance and was never heard from him again. Radar data shows that the initial call, the pilot was a 700 AGL on a climbing right turn. Radar also showed the airplane continued to climb with turns to the left and to the right, reaching 1,100 feet, and then the last radar hit was 700 feet AGL and a descending right turn, okay? He didn't fly the airplane first. And that's the bottom line. Remember what we talked about in the previous accident. I don't know about you, but when I think of what this fellow went through in those few minutes airborne, it sends chills down my spine. My heart and my prayers go out to him and his family and the previous pilot and his families. That being said, I think we need to learn from his experience. The best thing we can do for either pilot at this point would be to save someone else's life by learning from their mistakes in this mishap, okay, in their mishaps. So what is it we can learn from this mishap, the night landing into IMC? Well, the first thing is that he stacked the deck against himself, as we mentioned earlier. His currency at night, his currency in instruments, and his familiarity with this particular airplane, all was low. Getting recurrent is a good thing, but I would say that the conditions with all those things, you want to minimize the impact of all those things and just make it a very easy thing to do to get recurrent, okay? I'd say the conditions were probably pretty near graduate level, okay? No time to get used to it in the airplane. Low time in instrument conditions, that's a bad mix. Delaying the flight for better conditions would have been probably the best ADM, aeronautical decision-making call here. Unfortunately, he didn't have those hairs standing up on the back of his neck, and there was nobody sitting on his shoulder giving advice. So if you find yourself in a similar situation where you don't have the hair standing up on the back of your neck and you end up in this kind of a situation, your first priority is to get yourself on the gauges as quickly as you can, and you tune out any of the inputs you receive outside of the instrument panel 2 feet in front of your face. This game really just got serious. The most dangerous transition to make is to suddenly convert from VFR flying using outside references to inside flying using gyroscopic references, okay? You simply must force yourself to force yourself into an instrument crosscheck and concentrate on flying straight and level. Number one job. Once you have yourself under control, at that point you can start to consider trying to turn and climb. And I would not do them at the same time, one at a time. Don't make it harder on yourself here. Don't forget the illusions that would confront us in a similar situation. Remember, we're humans. Both these pilots, you and I, we're humans. This happens to us, whether we want to or not, whether we have 20,000 hours or not. Coriolis or turning illusion, that happened today, or for this, probably both of them. Tumbling and even the cinematographic illusions are big factors right about now, especially for the fellow in the night accident. Each one of these are sending competing position statements to the pilot's brain. with no outside reference, okay? You're in a turn, climbing. The body just doesn't know which way is up. Add to that the natural tendency for the eyes and the mind to rebel against being told to concentrate on one little instrument. Massive confusion was likely the result in both of these accidents. So, frankly, this is a situation that confronts lots of pilots every year. Unintentional VFR and IMC. We can go back last year to a real famous accident that hit the news and dominated the news for a while, and that was the Kobe Bryant helicopter crash. That's a perfect example. And worsening visibility in ceilings near the ground, the solo pilot made the decision to climb through a cloud layer to get on top. Good or bad, you be the judge. He was instrument rated, and the helicopter was equipped for instrument flight. But the Part 135 operation was VFR only, and he was obviously not current with instrument flying. Couldn't do it for work. Could he borrow the helicopter for a day? So in this instance, he did make it to 2,300 feet with the tops of the layer at 2,400 feet, but he made two critical errors. He did not get on the gauges, and he was flying well over 160 knots. No idea why he was going that fast. Helicopters can slow way down. Why not do it at 60? You got plenty of time to figure things out instead of getting there in a hurry. When he pitched up into the clouds, I think it is likely that he experienced a combination of things that led to this catastrophic disorientation. First was the inversion illusion, followed by the somatogravic, and then probably the elevator illusion as well. All of these things forced him to push the nose down and roll left in what became a very steep spiral. He probably couldn't understand why he's not leveling out. Why is it getting worse? His descent rate exceeded 4,000 feet per minute. Well, for any pilot, the key to survival, if you have to make a transition like this, would be to do one thing at a time. First is fly straight and level. Get on the gauges, and then get stable. When you have your heading under control, you have your altitude under control, then you can add another task to your plate. You can climb, or you can execute a turn, okay, as the situation warrants. But be deliberate. Use small head movements and fight for SA the whole time, okay? A successful outcome is relentless, all right? You have to keep working at it every second of the time. Do one thing at a time. Be aware that everything you're doing right now is leading you close to the abyss of loss of control. And once you get too far down that slope, you're not coming back. And this all is happening in large part because you're human. It really doesn't matter who you are and what you've experienced. The human systems we rely on for orientation are not built for flight into IMC, especially on a sudden situation like that thrust upon you. We have to approach all of that very carefully. But I think Winston Churchill actually had very good advice for pilots when he said, never give up, never surrender. That's what you got to do. Fly the airplane. Do one thing at a time. Stay under control. I hope you enjoyed the video. For me, it was an important one to make. So if you did, hit subscribe there. It's in the lower left corner. And hit the bell too if you'd like notifications. I appreciate that. I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time on FlyWire.